Welcome back, Mirai family. I'm David. We're in Florida again working on a very common species for bonsai. This is something you see at all the box stores. This is something you see on the mail. You can see this in most places of the world. This is a Schefflera, arboricola. These trees are often referred to as money trees, as umbrella trees. They have that very helicopter style propeller up on top. These are very popular with aerial roots. This is something that people often desire. This is the thing that you look for. It's also a reason that most people confuse it with a ficus. This is not a ficus. This is an entirely different species of tree. But like a ficus, they will produce a lot of aerial roots, which makes them very desirable. These can be banyan trees. They can be more single trunk trees. They can be a forest, or they can literally be a massive amount of aerial roots that come together and produce one crown. So you can have a lot of uses for these trees, which makes them very good for bonsai. This is a tropical variety of tree. They are relatively fast growing, but for a tropical tree, they're not so big on high intense UV exposure. Typically here in Florida, Central Florida, specifically in the Ocala National Forest, we protect these after about 2 o'clock in the afternoon when some of the real intense heat is hitting them. They typically are shaded out after that point. As far as leaf size, you can make these grow the size of a quarter if you stay on top of it. For this particular tree, you'll notice that it is completely pot bound. This thing became pot bound after its first year in this container. This is its third year in this container. If you're wondering why this is leafless now, this is in the greenhouse for 4 months at least in this part of Florida, because it's Florida, but we still get well below freezing temperatures. So this is in the greenhouse for several months. When they leave the greenhouse, they're generally going to drop all of the leaves because they're changing conditions. This is the only time that we're going to do a full defoliation on that, is when the leaves are going to drop anyway. Much like the fall color that you get with other broadleaf deciduous trees. If you're going to cut them all off, you're going to cut them all off when they're going to drop pretty close to anyway. So with this particular tree, all the leaves were cut off. They're starting to rebound and repop. Whenever we can, we always try to leave the petiole. Whenever you cut the leaves off and you take the petiole off with it, you basically lose 2 opportunities to close the door to the plant when it comes to pathogens. When you cut off the main part of the blade and you have the petiole and then the branch, it's almost like where the blade of the leaf is, there's a door. At the other end of the petiole, there's a door when it enters the actual stem of the tree. You leaving the petiole, when you cut them back, you basically close 2 doors. You save the tree from having dieback or any other issues when it comes to pests, fungus, and stuff like that. These don't really have a ton of natural predators. Aphids like them, but that's generally when the leaves are new, they're fragile, and they have not developed a cuticle. The cuticle is that waxy thickness that develops on a hardened off leaf. That protects it from too much transpiration. It protects it from too much UV exposure. So having taking this thing back in processes, leaving the petiole, I mean, you really do a lot for the branch. When it comes to a full defoliation on a tree, there is one issue with that. You can't always control where growth returns. The reason for that, because these are a rapid growing, fast metabolizing tropical tree, oftentimes those auxiliary buds that are often at the base of leaves, when you cut everything off, they become buried under the cambium, layer after layer after layer. Then when we remove the leaf, because we have given up all control at that point, when we've lost the leaf, we've lost the petiole, then you can't control where they pop back out again. The good thing about Schefflera compared to some other species is because they whorl, they're often going to just put a whorl at the tip of the branch. So when it comes to back budding, typically you would have to remove a good part of the leaf, or depending on the time of year, all of the leaf, to really get the back budding. Otherwise, it's going to stay a full whorl. When it comes to indoor plants, I'm always going to tell you that the tree came before the house. When somebody asks me, hey, is this a good indoor bonsai? This is something, specifically a Schefflera, that you see in large varieties on indoor trees. Oftentimes the leaves will be this big when they're brought inside. And someone will always throw the argument, well, I've had it inside for 30 years. How can you tell me it's not an indoor tree? My immediate follow-up is, how many times have you trimmed it over the course of a year? Typically, people tell me never. Well, that means the tree's not thriving. That means it's not putting on a lot of growth, which means not much is changing here. It is just a house plant getting by on core metabolic function. There's nothing else happening there. Put it out in the sun, you're going to have a rapid explosion of leaves. You're going to have a whole lot more growth in the trunk. And then as far as these aerial roots, you really need humidity and heat for this to happen. In producing aerial roots, we can achieve this in a magnitude of ways. The safest way is to leave the leaves on the tree, allow it to become pot bound. A lot of reason why they produce aerial roots, if there's a lack of humidity or something, is they've run out of space within the pot. So they send out aerial roots to find new ground because it has reached a point of stress. The good thing about this calculated stress is it have the leaves on it, so it's still functioning, it's still building sugars, carbs, it's still transpiring. Another way that you can produce the aerial roots is there is old techniques where people will set up these on a tray. It will be the same thing. It'll be a very shallow tray where the roots themselves are kind of in a very stasis point. So it's relying on the branches. So people will take drinking straws like you would drink any drink, and they'll prop it up underneath the branch, and that humidity within the straw will typically cause a root to form. It will start moving down the inside of the straw. Once it's slightly developed, you can remove the straw. It will continue going down to the pot. Another way that you can achieve this, which is still a safe way, but if you have a lot of open wounds or a lot of cuts that have not healed, it can be not so good for the tree. That method is using mist and humidity solely. Regardless of the condition of the roots, regardless of the leaves, people will run a mister within the canopy for about 15 minutes, an hour, and they'll do this for however long it takes. You're going to see aerial roots drop the fastest. It's the fastest way to achieve that. You're going to get more aerial roots because they're reaching for that humidity regardless of what's happening here, regardless of what's happening here. It's the perfect environment. During winter storage, we can still produce aerial roots. We can still grow these. How we achieve it is we put them underneath the bench. So if I'm looking in the greenhouse, I have benches about waist high. In some places I have higher benches depending on what the trees need. These I'm going to put directly on the ground underneath the bench. That is the most humid place. So you'll actually grow aerial roots in a higher quantity over winter with it under a table, not getting any sun, as opposed to full sun, using a mister, allowing it to get completely pot bound, or constantly manipulating the leaves. There are several ways to achieve this. This particular tree has been entirely root bound. 3 years it's been in here, has not been repotted. I'm going to show you a couple other examples where this was produced by having regular root pruning, and you'll see a much less amount of aerial roots across the tree. They're more single trunks. And then we'll also work on creating one of these from a pre-bonsai, because oftentimes you're going to find one and it's just going to be like this, but of no control. There's no method, rhyme, or reason to it. So we're going to try to work on these aerial roots and actually develop a tree. We could end up with a banyan. We could end up with just a large multi-trunk tree. But as far as the Schefflera arboricola, this is the Louisiana variety. I'm going to show you both variety, but I'm going to work on one. One is a standard arboricola, one is a Louisiana. The difference between them is the size of the leaf. That's really it. There are other varieties of Schefflera that come in variegated forms, some that have much larger leaves. I mean, this is a rather huge family for bonsai, for tropical trees, I should say. And it is one of the most common ones for bonsai. So follow along. We're going to do a couple different varieties of this so you can see the start to finish, and hopefully you get to this point one day. Just in sake of time, this is not an incredibly old tree. This is maybe a 15-year project. Could it have gone a little faster? Have we been considering how many aerial roots I want and all that before? Yes. How we ended up with this is kind of a staple showpiece at the nursery. Is it got too big for the average person to buy. So we just kept taking it back to get it in the door of the greenhouse, to get it under the table. In doing that for so many years, it started developing a style, so we just said, all right, we're going to pot it, and this is going to be a great example for Schefflera. So follow along, and we'll do a couple other trees. All right, so we have a Schefflera. This is the Louisiana variety. We are going to create some structure in this tree. I am not of the opinion yet whether we're going to have a single trunk, whether we're going to have multiple trunks. We'll have to take this thing back down to taper. You'll notice on here, we have very hardened off branches. The color is entirely different. And then we have more juvenile branches where they're green. This growth right here, this literally maybe 10 inches of growth right there, that is less than, that's probably 6 to 8 months of growth right there. It's not very long amount of time for the length that you actually get out of it. When you wire these, you're typically paying more attention to the primary structure than the secondary structure. The secondary tertiary structure is often changed, manipulated the most over the course of the year, or especially the winter. So we're going to take this thing back to a good solid foundation, and then we'll twig it out from there. The leaves on these can be reduced to about the size of a quarter. There are some rare varieties that can go smaller than that, but they're very hard to obtain. I've not seen one here in the north part of Florida. But the technical process as far as how you work on it, how you train it, should be the exact same. So we're going to go ahead, start with the outer perimeter, and we'll start working the tree back in and reducing it. Tapering will be on my mind. I am going to leave some leaves on there, that way I have a faster rebound. If I get to a point where I need to shorten it for a design part, I'm going to at least leave the petiole. That way I shut the door, I don't allow pathogens into the actual branch, and I reduce the chance of dieback. Also too, when it comes to getting wet, humid environment, a lot of rain this time of year, it also allows these things to heal faster the drier they are. So if I have a big open wound, it's going to take a while to heal, if heal at all. But if I leave the petiole, I have control and I reduce the chance of dieback. So, it's time. So we're only halfway through trimming this right now, and you can see the dramatic difference of wasted growth, something that's just been allowed to freely to grow without any control, versus where we need to take it back to. You also notice too, as far as when we go further into the tree, the leaves start getting smaller. You would think that because as the rest of the tree grows out, that those get more shaded, that they'll actually get larger underneath, but it's usually the opposite when it comes to these. In the situations where I was talking about removing the leaves entirely, if it comes to that point, this is where I was going with that. Completely uncontrolled. You can see this is a gigantic petiole. It is a gigantic leaf. So as far as taking this back, if you want to consider this an internode, you would take it way further back, because you'll notice on the actual stem itself, the further it goes out, like a ficus, the longer the internode gets, the larger the leaf gets. So this is why we take them back down to structure, and then we allow it to grow out from there. This is just a waste of energy to stick around. And a lot of tropicals, not all, but a lot, sacrifice branches only hinder the cause because they create giant areas that need to be healed. So I'm typically willing to always reduce a tree, take it back to taper, much more than I am just doing a solid trunk chop. I like this thing to be growing every single day, more than I want to see it completely leafless as though it's wintertime. When it comes to the tree itself, we're really looking for that width. This will make kind of its own separate secondary apex here. We'll allow this one to grow. That way, they're not competing apexes, but it allows some rise in the tree, because we do want a little space here. You can not necessarily make this like two trees that come together or a companion of sorts, but having a little bit higher side is a great alternative to just one big massive canopy. There's not a rule that says you have to do this a certain way. I mentioned before that you can make these individuals, you can create a forest out of them, you can create one solid trunk, you can have a magnitude of trunks that form a giant canopy, or in this case you can have one trunk area, a shared base with multiple fingers with two different heights in the apex, just to create something different. A lot of the limitations in bonsai is based on what we know about the species more so than there's not anybody sitting right there behind you and said, trees don't look like that, or this doesn't look like that. If you've ever seen one of these, they grow anywhere from hedging in your front yard to islands in a median, a roadway, to your grocery store parking lot. These can look so many different ways. So I would definitely encourage you to explore a little bit with the kind of the gift you have here of not one single uniform trunk. There's nothing on this that needs to be wired at this time. This is that fundamental part, taking the tree back, allowing it to expand, and then from here, now that we have some character, some direction in it, then maintaining that character by controlling where leaves pop out as far as too far out on the tip versus further in on the branch. We'll pluck off those new ones, cause it to back bud, and then we'll slowly reduce the tree from there with scissors. All right, so just to kind of recap, we've covered Schefflera arboricola, primarily focused on the Louisiana variety. These things are easy to propagate. It's a simple cutting. Air layering is not really necessary. These things produce roots like when you turn your back on them. So cutting's a very easy way to start something. You can also take multiple cuttings and fuse them together. You can go a lot of different ways with it. Overall in the species, we spoke about these things enjoying full sun, but if you're in an area with a high amount of UV, it's better to protect them after, say, 1, 2 o'clock in the peak heat of the day. They don't necessarily need that sun. If this was a Caliandra variety, they would literally fold up to show their dislike of the sun. Not every tropical tree is a hardcore sun lover. It does just as much damage to them as it does us. These can be multiple trunks, they can be fused, they can be separated by a forest, or they can be a single trunk with a wide canopy. A lot of times these are whorls at the tips of branches or at the tips of apical areas. In some cases, there's not a very clear branch structure, especially when you have trunks that are going every which way and they come together at the very end for the canopy. There's not a lot of insect problems on these. If so, it's usually the brand new growth that has no cuticle, has no means of protecting itself yet. Overall, this is a tree that works very well for bonsai. You can find these in more locations than you can most tropicals, like a ficus. Usually it's one or the other when you go somewhere. I hope when everybody looks at this, they see, hey, this is this inexpensive tree at the box store that I can actually turn into something pretty amazing. I hope you gain something from it. I hope you see it not just as a tropical alien tree, but it's a fast metabolizing broadleaf tree. So happy bonsai.